are not going back.
Welcome to Sidebar from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey, and I'm joined today by Rhonda Colvin, J.M. Rieger, and special guest Dan Baltz, whose official title is Chief Correspondent. So we're gonna wring it out of you, Dan. We're gonna get every last bit of information from you. We're back in our Washington, D.C. studio a week after the Democratic convention in Chicago, where Kamala Harris was introduced to the nation as the Democratic candidate for president after a whirlwind month, just 2 weeks since she named Tim Walz as her vice presidential running mate. So this week on Sidebar, we'll dive into the incredible sea change that we've seen in the presidential race. We'll talk about what is to come. And we'll also talk to Dan about his experience at conventions. How many conventions have you covered, Dan?
25.
25. Okay. But somewhere in the same year. So hasn't been 25. It's not like the Olympics. No,
I'm older, but not quite that old.
Okay, great. We'll also later on bring in our colleague Devlin Barrett, who's the author of the newsletter The Trump Trials, and he'll update us on the cases against former President Donald Trump. Now, the legal troubles are certainly delayed, but they have not gone away, and there were some significant developments this week. Let's start with the presidential race and the launch pad that the Democratic National Convention provided the Harris campaign. So, a little over 2 months until Election Day. And after Labor Day, I feel like we're all going to just get flung out of the cannon. It's such a mad sprint to Election Day. Dan, what are the big moments that are to come that could be the game changers or the pivot points?
Well, I think the biggest moment by far is the September 10th debate between Harris and Trump. And I think there's heightened interest in that for two reasons. One, because of what happened when Biden and Trump debated in June in Atlanta and what subsequently happened to Biden and how that completely changed the world in terms of our political campaign this year. But the second is because the vice president has not been in many unscripted situations, this is a question for her about how well she performs, but also a test for Donald Trump, who, had it not been for President Biden's problems in that first debate, I think there would have been more analysis, criticism, if you will, of what Trump's performance was like. I mean, it was not exactly a stellar performance by any means. And so I think both of them are kind of on trial in the voters' mind. And we know that this is a very close election. And as you say, Libby, these last X number of weeks, once you get past Labor Day, it's just kind of nonstop. Voters will start to vote in a matter of weeks. Then we're just in kind of this pell-mell rush and this struggle for every vote to get out.
Yeah, Rhonda, you're going to be at the debate in Philadelphia?
Yes.
In less than 2 weeks.
Less than 2 weeks. And I have to agree with Dan that it's all about the debate. I've even had people ask me, when is it? When is it coming on? What time is it? My brother actually texted me a few days ago, what time does it start? I'm like, we've got 2 weeks. So I think there's more interest in that debate for all the reasons Dan just laid out. I also think this will be sort of another introduction for Harris because people may not remember. We may remember her performance when she was a primary candidate for the 2020 presidential election. But
because she was on the stage with all the candidates.
And she had a lot of good, moments. There were some one-liners I remember specifically against Biden when she was up against Biden. So she seemed prepared for that debate as well. I'm just wondering what this one looks like. And so I think a lot of Americans will be tuning in to just see her performance. I think that everyone's also interested in where this puts the former president as well. We can look back to his debate performances, well, all of them really, but think about the Hillary Clinton ones.
Remember him lurking around the
Everybody
stage?
remembers the lurking.
It felt menacing to me, but I think for some people it came across as commanding. I mean, that's the interpretation, right? That's all how we view, the lens with which we view. I'm watching body language, I'm watching tone. Does Trump act demeaning towards Kamala Harris? How does she treat his aggression or apathy, whatever he does? How do they play against each other?
She's the lesser known quantity going into this debate, but in some ways this debate is equally high stakes, right? Because Harris needs to take this opportunity to define herself, what we expect to be possibly her biggest audience of the general election here, even bigger than the convention. And for Trump, it's that kind of mentality that you were just talking about, Libby, like what's his body language like? How many times does he interrupt Harris? Does he stay on script? And ultimately, can he define her? He really has not stayed on message the way that his campaign would have liked him to so far. It's been weeks at this point. The debate, it's Trump's last chance to define Harris, possibly one of his last chances in the general election when people are going to be voting.
I mean, there's still 2 months, but I mean,
Yeah.
like we were already talking about like locking in images, but I look at how J.D. Vance's image was so locked in. Dan, like the Republicans sort of seemed to fail to present the J.D. Vance they wanted Americans to see. And this other image of him as being sort of churlish and surly and not authentic seems to have stuck.
Yeah, and I think Democrats have done, a pretty skillful job of pushing that idea, and he's played into it. I mean, he was a controversial pick. Let's face it. I mean, Doug Burnham was a very safe pick, the governor of North Dakota. Marco Rubio is a proven politician with some sophistication on the national stage. J.D. Vance, no. And J.D. Vance, we know, went through a kind of a metamorphosis with how he viewed Donald Trump. So there was a lot of baggage that he brought into that. And I think that his critics have been able to exploit it, and he's played into it. And so, he's brand new on the national stage. Nobody knows anything about him. And the degree to which he has kind of leaned into some of these controversial statements has only hurt him.
What about key messages and how the candidates talk about what they believe in and what the opposition does or is? We're taping this on Thursday, a few hours ahead of when CNN is going to air this interview with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. It's getting a lot of attention before it even happens. How does Kamala Harris define herself, Dan, and how does she define her opponent in moments like this?
Defining her opponent is a lot easier. I mean, she was able to do some of that at the convention, as were many of the speakers, Michelle Obama, perhaps most notably, in the way she kind of, took him down. So we know the attack lines that she will use against him. As she said it in the convention, he is an unserious man. But were he to get back in the Oval Office, there would be serious consequences. That's a paraphrase. Defining herself is a little bit more difficult. When she ran for president in 2019, she never made it to 2020, as we know. She defined herself more on the left, in part because that was kind of the way the debate was moving among the candidates. As a member of the Biden administration, she's more, center left rather than hard left. And I think at the convention, she tried to project that persona and that ideology in a kind of a soft way. But I think that throughout the campaign, that's partly what she's going to do. There is this debate that's going on about how detailed should she be about policy? How much should she resist getting into the weeds on policy and kind of stay above and do a more values-based campaign? And to date, she has preferred, the values-based and the kind of higher elevation, the broader strokes rather than the details. But the debate will be a moment in which she's asked about some of these things. And if she does additional interviews in addition to the CNN interview, that will be part of it. So she's going to have to navigate that. But I think that the goal at this point seems to be, let's stay above these things as best we can.
Because she hasn't done that solo interview, that I am the candidate or the emerging candidate prior to this interview. There's a lot of pressure on it, a lot of focus and attention. I guess I wonder how long that lasts. I mean, it depends on how she performs. But this is not like Sarah Palin. I mean, because some of the Republicans I've been talking to are acting as though Kamala Harris has never been interviewed. Like, she had a lot of interviews when she was vice president. She's had interviews as a senator. She had interviews on the campaign trail. So, I mean, when Sarah Palin came on the stage, she had never been under the national media spotlight and scrutiny. So when Katie Couric says to you, what do you read? And she sort of has like a brain blank moment, that's a kind of stuff that's not going to happen to Kamala Harris.
That's true. And you also have to look at how or if interviews are really enduring in, the public awareness. They happen, and then usually something else happens, and campaigns are able to move things along, and people forget if there was a gaffe, if there was something like the Sarah Palin moment. And even if you look at the Sarah Palin moment, that happened, the 60 Minutes interview happened weeks ahead of the election, but they were still very competitive when it came to votes. So it's not like a bad interview tanks a candidate's ability to win, but And especially with this election as well, everything has been static and baked in for about a year. A lot of people already know how they're going to vote. I do not know if an interview is going to change that. Now, that's not to say, I mean, we're all journalists. That's not to say that I don't think an interview should happen, but I don't know how enduring they are and how much they move the needle.
And I guess what's clippable? What are the sound bites and easily digestible moments from it that end up going viral or sticking in people's minds, right?
I find it interesting that that there is so much attention on the question of an interview, because normally in the course of a campaign, interviews are kind of part of the process, and nobody takes any one interview all that seriously unless there's a kind of major meltdown or something like that. With Sarah Palin, you're right. I mean, nobody knew her. She was also the vice presidential nominee.
I knew her.
You knew her, right? I had written about her primary against Governor Murkowski that year before she got elected. But for Harris, this notion that this interview, the CNN interview or whatever, has gotten so much attention, I think is a combination of the nature of our politics right now, which is that everything, no matter large or small, is treated as large. If it hadn't happened before, this could turn out to be, a non-issue. But we should remember, after Biden had the bad debate, there was this pressure for him to do an interview, right? To sit down and talk about things. And he did with George Stephanopoulos from ABC, and it didn't work. So we know what happens if somebody doesn't meet expectations. So the question is, what are the expectations for Harris in any of these unscripted settings?
Oh, that's a really great point. What are the expectations for her, JM?
She needs to present herself as kind of the challenger here, right? That's a good lane for her to be in against Trump, because Trump in some ways is sort of, they're both pseudo incumbents.
Right. Trump
sort of is an incumbent. He's just not running for 2 straight terms. But the more she can present herself as this change agent, a lot of Americans think the country's on the wrong track. They want change. So if Harris can present that, whether that's very specific on policy or whether that's just high level values, as Dan was pointing out, that is, I think, a good position for her to be in. And I would imagine that that's as much what she's trying to get out of this interview as it is maybe going into a litany list of a State of the Union style policy speech, if you will.
We're talking a lot about Kamala Harris, and we're not talking about Donald Trump. And if Donald Trump were a fan of Sidebar, I think it would make him crazy that we're not talking about him, because so much of the focus, Dan, you point out, like the metrics by which he judges success, Kamala Harris is beating him on right now, like crowd size, fundraising, enthusiasm. Let's talk about Donald Trump and the big moments for him over the next couple of weeks, Dan. I think we were talking about how the test for a lot of us, and we've been talking about this for weeks, is can he stick to the script? Can he do what his campaign wants him to do?
I guess you could say really from the time he delivered his acceptance speech in Milwaukee, which, as we remember, was way too long and way too rambling and way too unfocused. He's not been an effective candidate. And he's been thrown off in particular by the arrival of Harris rather than Biden. He misses Biden very much. But as she says, there's no going back. This is the race he now has. And he's struggled to figure out a way to take her on and to be an effective advocate for his own positions. I think the question is twofold. One is, does he make a shift? Is he able to, A, become more disciplined, and B, get back to kind of the way he is as a candidate? He's never going to be completely disciplined. But in 2016, we know that August was a very bad month for him, and he shook up the campaign, and there were all these questions about it. But as the fall went on, despite some hiccups, he became a more reliable candidate, if you will, and was able to put more focus on Hillary Clinton rather than himself. So I think that's the big question. But I think the second question is, let's say he doesn't quite make it to where the campaign would like it. Is the campaign, with the money they have and the advertising they're going to be able to do, able to deliver the message against Harris that Trump himself is not so skillful or effective at doing? And I think that also is an unanswered question, because that we're just in the opening stage of that.
I mean, they're so much more organized than they were 8 years ago, right? That campaign infrastructure and the ability to go out on the airwaves with that messaging could be quite.
It could be, although, I mean, the fact that he decided to bring back Corey Lewandowski, who was his campaign manager when he won the nomination in 2016, and put him in the mix with Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita, who have been the two, major domos of the campaign, raises questions in my mind of how stable that internal operation is going to be over the next number of weeks.
Go ahead, Rhonda. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the point Dan just made about how, Trump hasn't been listening to his campaign staffers or national Republicans who have asked him to stay on message. You almost wonder, can the Trump campaign, who they're trying to run an actual campaign, can they run without Trump and let Trump be Trump? I don't know if that works, but it would be it's going to be fascinating to see how it all plays out, because we haven't been getting any sort of indication that he is going to come into line with what they're asking him to do. I mean, there have been so many opportunities. We now are on, week 3, week 4 of him being able, or he should be able to, stay in line, but he still hasn't gotten his footing.
Well, I mean, the convention can be this chance to set the tone, set the mood, run out of the gate with enthusiasm. And the Democrats did that last week, and they're running. And we'll see how they continue to run. But the Republican, I mean, it was this halting, sloppy because of Trump's speech, because of J.D. Vance's launch. And then, Donald Trump went on a Truth Social rant last night, Wednesday night, JM. What was he focused on?
A lot.
Is there a focus?
A lot. It's all over the place. But he baked into it. Trump is a baked in quantity, right? Folks know who he is. And part of that baked in quantity is a lot of grievance and complaining about folks in general, his political opponents, etc. But the last few weeks here, and even the last 24 hours, have been kind of a remarkable stretch of really a backwards-looking campaign for Trump, when he's talking about a military tribunal for Obama, when he's talking about jailing Biden, Harris, Nancy Pelosi.
I mean, just
Hillary
let those
Clinton.
words sink in for a moment.
Right. I mean, this is remarkable. A normal candidate, this would be disqualifying, right? They would be out of the race potentially.
I'm going to say this directly because you are far too polite to say this, but he also reposted something that referred to Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton as doing sexual acts. And this is, if you're, I was going to say a woman, but a human who's not sure about the policies, but if you're considering voting for Trump or considering sitting out, that sort of stuff can be such a turnoff. I guess I'm wondering how much that penetrates the consciousness. It's hard for us as journalists because we almost don't want to talk about it because it's so crude and it's uncomfortable to talk about. But if we don't talk about it, then people don't know about it because a lot of people aren't hanging out on Truth Social on Wednesday night.
Our colleague Hannah Knowles did a wonderful piece on the 24 hours of Donald Trump. And for anybody who wants to see how much he went off the rails, that piece sums it up quite well. It is an interesting question, Libby, of how much we do or don't pay attention to that, because in many ways it's so much in line with what we have seen and heard before from him. And I think there are a lot of voters, particularly in his camp, who discount it or ignore it, or some of them enjoy it. I mean, they get a kick out of it in a perverse, terribly perverse way. But we are obliged to keep bringing that forward because that is a part of who Donald Trump is and has been. And we get accused sometimes of normalizing him if we don't pay serious attention to it. And these are judgment calls that we have to make. But what he did over the last 24 hours is just a reminder of, again, undisciplined is not the right word for it. I mean, kind of, just strange impulses on his part that he feels the need to do these things.
And I don't think it's good for him. Now, maybe, your average undecided voter, the ones that are out there, are not paying attention to this truth repost, right? But voters want to hear about what he's going to do on the economy, on inflation, on the border, on foreign policy. They don't, even when he talks about the 2020 election, which he does all the time, that's not where his campaign wants him to be. Now, Trump thinks he won the last two elections, so he's going to trust his own guts over his even closest advisors. But at the moment, this is not, and the poll numbers show us he's starting to fall a little in the polls. This is not where his campaign wants him looking backwards the way he is.
A lost opportunity. Well, Dan, stay with us. When we come back, we'll talk about your years of convention coverage and the wisdom you've gained, highlights, lowlights, and everything in between. Stay with us. This is Sidebar from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey with Rhonda Colvin, J.M. Rieger, and Chief Correspondent Dan Baltz. You laugh when I say Chief Correspondent. Why do you laugh?
It's a strange title.
It's a very well-deserved title.
Well, thank you. You're very kind.
Best convention?
Well, it's an interesting question. The first convention I did was 1968 in Chicago. I was fresh out of college. I was working for my hometown newspaper. We got one credential. Nobody on the reporting staff seemed to want to go to Chicago. The editor I worked for, who was a wonderful, smart, talented, encouraging editor, said, if you want to go to Chicago, here's a credential. And I leapt at the chance. We all remember that as the most tumultuous, the most violent, the most, memorable convention, really in the modern history of conventions. So in a sense, for me, it's been all downhill since then, right? I mean, nothing can quite compare with that. I would spend, late afternoon to evening in the convention hall, and then, earlier in the day and late at night into Grant Park, basically, to kind of be with the demonstrations and to see what was going on. So I wrote a lot of stories. I have looked back on some of them, and I cringe at some of the things I wrote at the time. But others were a reminder of kind of what that period of American history was like. That was as we know, it was a violent year. 2 assassinations. A president who stood down, Lyndon Johnson. A convention. There's an interesting parallel between Vice President Harris and Hubert Humphrey, who was the vice president to Lyndon Johnson. Neither ran in a primary, and both became the nominees of their party. Much different reasons. And Harris's convention turned out, extremely well for her. Humphrey's convention was a disaster, and it took him most of the campaign to get back in the race. So that was, that's in a sense the highlight. If you fast forward to this year, 2024, what's interesting is that each of those conventions happened at a time when the political party at that moment, when the people in that party believed they were going to win or that they had a good chance of winning. And in a sense, it shows how much the world changed between the end of the Republican convention and the opening of the Democratic convention. People said last week when we were in Chicago, this is the most unified Democratic convention that we've seen. This was what you would hear from Democrats. So I was thinking, well, is that really right? Because I thought 2008, when Barack Obama was nominated in Denver, and that scene.
He was in the stadium outdoors.
Right. He was at the Denver Broncos football stadium. And I mean, it was a moment of elation on the part of a lot of Democrats. But as I thought about that convention, there was still a kind of a hangover from the long battle that he had waged with Hillary Clinton. I mean, that was an epic primary between the two of them. And those wounds were not fully healed. I think Hillary Clinton and the Obama team themselves did everything they could, but among the Hillary Clinton supporters, there were still bad feelings. And so, in a sense, that was not as united a convention, even though it ended up in kind of jubilation. So those are the comparisons. I've thought about other conventions I've covered. Basically, I did 68, and then I didn't do another convention until I was here at the Post. And that started here at 78. So 80 was the first year. So I've done all the conventions since then, Republican and Democratic. I look back on both the 1980 conventions as fascinating and memorable for different reasons. The 80 Republican convention, which was in Detroit, was a moment of unbelievable drama when Ronald Reagan was negotiating with agents of former President Gerald Ford to make him the vice president. And Luke Cannon, who was our Reagan reporter at the time, had written at the beginning of that week that George H.W. Bush was like 90% of the way there to becoming the vice president. And then these negotiations happened. And Lou and David Broder, our lead political reporter at the time, were in our workspace, and they had been told by a source that if this didn't come together by 10 o'clock, it was not going to happen. Maybe it was 9 o'clock. I'm not sure of the time. Anyway, that deadline came and went. And meanwhile, the speculation was, running rampant. CBS, as I recall, reported that a deal had been cut between Reagan and Ford to be the vice president. That turned out not to be true. Reagan had to come to the hall to kind of quiet everybody and to say, George H.W. Bush is going to be my vice president. Lou had come to the hall at that point, and he called back to David and said, I'll be back shortly, or, whatever. And David, according to Lou, who I communicated with recently, David said to Lou, well, Ben Bradley, who was our executive editor at the time, who was in the workspace, Ben says he's going to give you a big kiss when you come back. And Lou said, well, if that's the case, I'm not coming back. But he said, I did go back, and Ben gave me a big hug. So that convention was memorable. The Democrats' convention was also memorable because of the Kennedy, Jimmy Carter kind of dust up, if you will. I mean, Kennedy had lost the battle, but had not given up, and tried to engineer a change in the rules that might open the convention up. Failed on that. Carter, Kennedy gave this, amazing kind of valedictory speech. The dream will never die. And then Carter gave his acceptance speech, and then Kennedy came up on stage for what's the typical, tableau of unity, right? And Carter almost literally chased him around the stage, hoping to have this scene where they're both gripping their hands and, up in the air. And Kennedy would not let it happen. He just, continued to kind of pretend that Jimmy Carter was not on that stage. And our colleague at the time, Mary McGrory, or maybe she hadn't even come to the Post at that point, probably was still at the Washington Star. Mary said that Jimmy Carter at that moment looked like an airline pilot whose passengers had all run off with the hostage takers. And I mean, Mary had a way of being able to sum everything up. So those two conventions are very memorable. The other thing is the degree to which conventions have changed. In the old days, I mean, if you go back to 60 or even 80, and conventions did business, and conventions had platform battles, and conventions had floor fights, and the parties got to the conventions and things weren't all done. Sometimes the vice president hadn't been picked. They were literally picked on the night before the acceptance speech by the nominee. We have certainly evolved, and we evolved pretty rapidly, that these are now totally scripted events down to the minute, even though some speakers go a little beyond their allotted time, as Bill Clinton did in 2012 at the Obama convention.
And this week, this year as well.
And this year as well, although not as much as he did in 2012, but yes. But that's, I guess that's what you get when you get Bill Clinton to speak. So they are less dramatic. They are less newsworthy. They are fully controlled, and they're the one opportunity for a nominee to have the stage to him or herself, to be able to do what we've been talking about with Harris, which is to project a series of messages, biographical, ideological, policy-based, that give people a sense of who they are and what they want to do. So more recent conventions have been less memorable.
Dan, thank you so much for staying and talking with us. This is Sidebar from the Washington Post. Welcome, Devlin Barrett, co-author of The Trump Trials, as well as a reporter here covering justice, crimes, all the good things. I feel like I'm introducing a Law and Order episode or character. Devlin, we wanted you to come in to talk to us about all these updates that are happening in the cases against Donald Trump. Let's start with the January 6th case. So this week, Jack Smith filed an updated indictment, and this strips out things that issue could be taken with after the Supreme Court ruled that presidents have this widespread immunity. So how did Jack Smith retool his indictment? What did he strip out? Let's start with that.
Sure.
Try to make this stick this time.
Sure. So just to explain what he's dealing with, the Supreme Court ruled presidents generally have immunity for official acts. And they said very explicitly that one set of official acts that Trump cannot be prosecuted for is trying to push the Justice Department in late 2020 to help further his claims of mass voter fraud, which wasn't real, but he wanted the Justice Department to suggest that it was. Supreme Court said that's out of bounds. That's squarely within his role as the president to instruct an agency what he wants done. So that was a big chunk of the original indictment. Jack Smith has now stripped all that out of there. That means that one of the consequences of that is that one of his unindicted co-conspirators also falls out. That's Jeffrey Clark, the former DOJ official who was so eager to help Trump in that effort, just over the objections of basically the entire rest of the leadership of the Justice Department. So Jeff Clark is no longer an unindicted co-conspirator in that case. The overall indictment, just taking that part out and a couple other things they took out, basically cuts 9 pages out of what was a 45-page indictment. So it's shorter, it's tighter. He did add some things too, but the overall approach was to strip out those things that it seems pretty clear from. There are parts of the Supreme Court ruling that are not super clear, but the one part that is clear is that this issue of the Justice Department should not be in there, the conservative supermajority found. So that stuff is all removed now.
What did he have to do to get to this point? Like, what steps did he have to go through to get here?
So to do a superseder is a type of indictment. It's essentially an updated version of the indictment, a revised indictment. It's not that uncommon in cases to have superseders. But in this case, what he did, because the part of the Supreme Court ruling was about what evidence can be presented to a jury on this stuff, not just that you can't charge official acts as crimes, but evidence of official acts, the Supreme Court ruled, cannot be used to help prove that that a president committed crimes that weren't official acts. If that seems complicated, it's because it is. So anyway, Jack Smith got a new grand jury to look at essentially a clean set of evidence that did not have official acts in it. And that grand jury is the one that issued this new superseding indictment.
So they're looking at it with totally fresh eyes. They're not coming to it with the baggage. They're not saying, oh, this is missing, you change this. So another grand jury has found that this is a case that should go forward. I mean, that seems pretty remarkable to me. We've got quite a few grand juries now who've had their hands full with Donald Trump cases.
Right. I mean, there's the old saw that, a prosecutor can indict a ham sandwich because grand juries often agree with prosecutors. That is generally true. It is extremely rare for a grand jury to disagree with the prosecutor. But yes, having said that, they have found cause to issue this indictment. So the process is rolling forward. But I think you just have to keep in mind, this is going to be a very slow process. And the sort of unspoken, unresolved challenge that this new superseding indictment still faces is that there were other pieces of evidence, other types of evidence. The Supreme Court was very vague as to whether they should be thought of as official acts or not, such as tweets, his conversations with Mike Pence. At times in the Supreme Court decision, they suggest those things probably are official acts, but they don't actually say it. Now, I think you have to, when you think about like what does Jack Smith do with that, he's kind of stuck between two polar different opinions of how to do this. Judge Chutkan, the trial judge, clearly has a different view of this than the Supreme Court conservative majority. So on the one hand, Jack Smith's immediate task is to present Judge Chutkan with a set of evidence and a new sort of set of lines here that Judge Chutkan will agree is acceptable. But all of that happens within the framework of this is almost certainly going to go back to the Supreme Court. And it's almost certainly the case that the Supreme Court will not agree with Judge Chutkan on where the lines are. So, I wouldn't call it threading the needle so much as becoming like a ping pong ball in the court process. And that's what Jack Smith is facing.
There was a critical timeline on this. Can you explain the 60-day rule and why that's so essential right now?
Nothing I love to geek out about more. So the 60-day rule, the bane of my existence for the last 8+ years, is a rule in DOJ. It's not really written down. It's not really clear exactly what falls inside and out, but it is clear that DOJ officials love to argue about it. The 60-day rule says that the Justice Department should take no overt investigative steps within 60 days of an election that could be perceived by the public to be trying to sort of like pick a side, could have an effect. And that's the general idea of the 60-day rule. And so Smith filed this indictment about 9 or 10 days before the 60-day rule would kick into effect. The clock was ticking on him doing this. The window was closing, and he got it in time to do it. This is sort of way down in the weeds, but there's another deadline that he was coming up against, which explains why this happened this week. By Friday, he is supposed to submit to Judge Chutkan, the trial judge in this case, a sort of proposal for how they would like to proceed with having hearings and briefings and arguments about what is an official act, what isn't, what can be in the case, what can't. And it would be bad form. Prosecutors would generally consider it very bad form to offer up a schedule and then, like, after offering the judge a plan forward, almost do sort of a jack in the box, say, surprise, new indictment, this changes everything,
Gotcha.
Good luck. So as a matter of sort of protocol and respect for the judge, it makes a lot of sense to do a superseder before that Friday deadline.
And the Trump team also has to get that proposed plan in to Judge Chutkan by tomorrow as well.
Correct. And I think the odds of the Jack Smith and the Trump team agreeing on what this schedule should be is pretty low.
Yeah.
The one thing that might get them into agreement is you can tell Jack Smith has no interest in rushing now. He has been knocked back by both the Supreme Court in this case and another federal judge in his other case. There's no reason to hurry now. So I think, unlike a lot of what we've seen previous to this, he is not going to be in the hurry that he once was with these cases.
Rhonda, where does this case fit in to the rest of the Trump cases? Rhonda was saying, and maybe we can build this, we should have like a board or a graphic that shows like the cases, almost like cars, like which ones, kind of moving down the track first, or because it's been such a bumper car summer. So where does the January 6th case fit in here?
Well, it feels with the new developments, this one, it has legs, even though, as Devlin has just pointed out, this is just going to be a continued long slog. Like, this is not wrapping up before the election. I love the point you made about Smith is not in any rush, which actually should fly in the face of any claims that it's political, because if he was in a rush, he would do this before November really quickly. But it does seem like he wants an actual case. And we do know if Trump is elected, it is likely Jack Smith will no longer have
Correct.
this case. I think that's fair to say. But I feel like this is the one that has some credence enough for it to keep going. And it's when you look at the other ones, they seem so far back. Like, I know we're going to get into it.
Get into it. Go for it.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
Fulton County, that is, we had the new file this week on racial animus, but they were also in the process of appealing, or it has been accepted as an appeal, to throw Fani Willis off of it, appeal the judge's decision to keep her on. And that's not being taken up until like December.
Right.
Those appeal judges don't have to rule until like March? So, or somewhere in the spring of next year?
Appeals cases take very long. I think one of the things that's challenging for us as reporters is I think the public has an expectation, because there's so many TV shows about so many court cases, that these things move fast. And
Definitely,
in
it
fact,
wraps
they
up in
move
48
quite
minutes.
slow.
Yeah.
Very, very slow. And the issues in these cases are complicated. The courts have not done something like this before. And so Trump has been fairly successful in playing not the law or the facts, although I think he's got a mixed result on that. On playing the clock, he's been very successful.
So you mentioned the Georgia case. So Trump's team is trying to disqualify Fani Willis. Can you explain a little bit more of what Rhonda was talking about there?
Right. So if you cast your memory back to earlier this year, I know it can be sometimes a blur, but it came out that the lawyer that Fani Willis had hired to manage the case against Trump and more than a dozen other defendants, that she had a romantic relationship with him. And a bunch of the defense lawyers objected and said, this is essentially giving a job for a personal reason and getting some benefit back from that because they went on vacations together. The trial judge said, basically said he didn't like it. He didn't think everyone necessarily being honest about what has happened, but he said there was no reason to dismiss the case because of it. But that issue is being appealed.
But Nathan Wade took himself out. I mean, he was taken out of the equation. So he's gone, moving forward.
The judge said one of you has
to go. Right.
And the district attorney can't really leave. So the writing was on the wall there for Nathan Wade.
Right.
So that is sort of the whole case has sort of been in limbo since this issue emerged. And to Rhonda's point, the Trump lawyers have now raised this new argument that essentially by accusing the Trump side of being racist towards her, the DA is somehow injecting racial animus into the case, and that's unfair, and therefore the case should be thrown out. I think the way I would explain it is the Trump lawyers have, through all four of these criminal cases, taken very much a kitchen sink approach to everything. And that's not unique to defense lawyers. There's a lot of defense lawyers who take a kitchen sink approach to defense work. And, they're throwing everything they can and seeing if anything sticks. It may be that nothing in the Georgia case, none of these defense gambits work. But even if they don't, you have eaten up so much clock already.
And sometimes you get lucky. I mean, look at the Supreme Court. I mean, with the claims of immunity, that the court, that has been such a game changer for having this conservative supermajority Supreme Court say so many of these presidential acts are considered to be, non-prosecutable. Sometimes you
right, and very few people I think could have predicted when the Georgia case was filed, for instance, that there would be this relationship scandal that would, sort of derail and delay everything for, a year and counting, essentially. I mean, if you think about like when this started, by the time that issue is decided by the state court of appeals, like it will definitely be more than a year. So there's a lot of clock being ground away by this process.
JM, we are constantly wondering, and we have polls that sort of give us some insight, but we're constantly wondering how any of this plays really politically. And what are you watching in these critical 2 months of the campaign as these cases kind of bump along, how Trump uses them, how Kamala Harris uses them, or their supporters?
I mean, Harris has put it kind of front and center, right? She uses this line, I know Donald Trump's type. She's talking about some of his past things that he settled, but also his current legal issues. And we know that Trump took a little bit of a polling hit after the conviction in the New York case came down. But this race has shifted for how we were just talking in the last segment, how static the race has been. But there have been some monumental shifts. We entered the year thinking that we were going to have multiple Trump trials potentially happening, even simultaneously, right? And now we're in a situation where the only one in all likelihood at this point, and there's still a few months left in the year, but that's going to go to trial before the new year, before a potential Trump second term, is this New York case, right? And I don't know that many people were necessarily predicting that on the 1st of January, 2024.
Yeah, everyone, you guys were calling it the runt of the litter case, right? The New York case was like the little case. We still do see sentencing looming on that.
Yes, but I got to tell you, one of the ways you can look at what Jack Smith filed in his D.C. case is in some ways very ominous for the New York case to survive, because what Smith decided as a prosecutor, now, have to be absolutely clear on one thing. Jack Smith has nothing to do with the New York case. I don't think as a general matter, the feds think all that highly of the New York case. But it exists and it is being run, and these things do not exist. None of these things exist in a vacuum. But when Jack Smith decided to take out of his indictment the Trump conversations with White House staff and aides, there is a potential implication of that for the New York case. And the potential implication is that jury heard evidence of Trump having conversations in the White House with White House officials, White House aides. Two of those aides testified to the jury. Now, the Supreme Court ruling came after that trial, but the Supreme Court ruling said official acts should not be presented as evidence to the jury. Jack Smith seems to agree now that that sort of evidence should not be put before a jury.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay. Just like regular Libby here.
Of course.
The New York case was about paying money to an adult film actress to allegedly cover up an affair. And he didn't claim that on the paperwork. So it's like a paperwork story. It's like a sex scandal. But it's all about stuff that happened before the White House, while he was on the campaign trail, before he ever became president. Right. So how is any of that an official act?
Because some of the evidence that the jury heard was from a White House communications, this White House spokesperson named Hope Hicks. And it was about her conversations with Donald Trump when he was president. And he said things to her at the time like, well, it's better if this Stormy Daniels stuff comes out now as opposed to during the election. And the prosecution told the jury in its closing arguments that that was very important testimony and critical testimony to understanding Donald Trump's state of mind and his motives.
I get that it like happens at the White House. It's with the White House staffer, but some of this just doesn't pass like the logic test of how far, what are you allowed to do just because you have the title as president?
Said in her concurring opinion, she did not agree with the majority that this type of evidence should be barred from the jury, that it became, I'm paraphrasing, but she basically said it becomes too forced and contrived to keep the evidence itself, like so the jury can't hear this, as opposed to a jury can hear it as evidence, as it was used in that case, of potential motive or state of mind, without it being, the crime happened in the Oval Office. So there is definitely a very rational argument, I think, to make. Like, I'm just thinking back to like how if this was the Clinton scandal with Monica Lewinsky, how would the Supreme Court be like, hey, official acts happened in the White House? It kind of defies logic sometimes. I think we are still trying to wrap our brains around how incredibly consequential this immunity decision by the Supreme Court will be for all future presidents. Yeah, it's going to be fascinating. I remember many years ago in the early days of the Trump administration covering the Justice Department, and someone said to me, that the real danger of Trump is that he will greatly weaken the presidency because he will keep testing his limits and he will keep pushing boundaries until finally the courts and Congress have to make the presidency itself weaker to deal with Trump. And in fact, while I thought that was a very interesting observation and thought, in fact, what this immunity decision shows is that by Trump testing those limits and testing those boundaries, what in fact has happened is that the Supreme Court has made the presidency much, much more powerful than it has been before. And what will future presidents do with that power is sort of the big unanswerable question. I want to point out that Donald Trump is turning our attention to the Jack Smith filing and the court cases, because we were talking earlier in this episode, Devlin, about how Donald Trump has been using Truth Social to just like emote, just like get it all out there. JM, let's look at some of the truths that Trump put out over the last 24 hours related to his court cases. I'm going to read some of this for those of us who are listening to us. In an effort to resurrect a quote-unquote dead witch hunt in Washington, D.C., in an act of desperation and in order to save face, the illegally appointed special counsel deranged Jack Smith has brought a ridiculous new indictment against me. It goes on and on from there. It is a big, chunky, meaty graph. I think there's even more that we can look at as well. This is a focus of his. And so and here it just keeps going. And I mean, here are the big words in all caps: manipulated, rigged, it's a rant. And if it were on camera, people would have like their jaws on the floor probably. But
the laptop from hell, that
Oh,
I was wondering what was that referring, and then now I see it's Hunter Biden's laptop. Okay.
the laptop from hell.
It's very
Things jump out to
descriptive.
you. Things jump out. It is very descriptive. So Donald Trump is turning our attention to this. Like, he's shining a spotlight on it. I know he's trying to put it under the mantle of like injustice and being persecuted, and the system's like against me. They're trying to shut me down. But
Yeah, this is the theme in some ways it's the theme he's hit on throughout the campaign, right? It's us against them. They're coming after me. They're coming after you next. These trials are election interference. These are his words, how he's describing this. And much like his defense lawyers are sort of taking the kitchen sink approach, to borrow Devlin's word here, on these motions, he's sort of taking the kitchen sink approach in how he talks about these cases on the campaign trail, right? I do want to piggyback off of something as well on the Supreme Court stuff on the January 6th thing that I think is but I'd love to get Devlin's thoughts on this, but is an interesting window into how this might play out, which is the Mike Pence conversation. Because Roberts talked about that a little bit during oral arguments of how much of that is an official act, and is Pence's role as president pro temp, or president of the Senate, is that an official act? And Trump talking to him about that. And as we talk about things getting litigated out, that seems sort of central to
Absolutely.
so Mike Pence is the vice president.
Yeah.
He's someone who's going to run for office again. So he's a candidate. He's running for office back then. And he's the president of the Senate. 3 totally different roles.
Yeah.
Right. And so the issue is, one of the allegations in the indictment, the original indictment, is that, and this has been well reported, it's not really up for debate so much, that Trump pressured Mike Pence in the January 6th certification. It's a ritual. It's not supposed to be some sort of fact exercise or trial by the Senate. Trump pressured Mike Pence to not certify the election results. And Pence said, essentially, I can't do that. That's not what my role is there. My role is to just say, yes, we have counted, and these are the results. That is charged conduct in the old indictment and the new indictment. But to your point, the Supreme Court really seemed to be suggesting that it did not like the Mike Pence stuff as evidence against Trump. And it may, at some future point, consider that to be official acts. Mike Pence, because of the way the government is structured under the Constitution, Mike Pence essentially wears 2 hats, which is the ceremonial president of the Senate, but also the very non-ceremonial vice president, the number 2 person in the executive branch. And so what Roberts was getting at when he said that is like, so in what vein is he talking to Mike Pence in those conversations? Is he really talking to his vice president, or is he really just, which would be an official act? I think everyone is clear on that. Or is he really talking to, the president of the Senate? I think, honestly, the real world answer is he's talking to both. And how you parse that out, I think, is very difficult. I think one of the ways in which Smith could be in deep trouble here with this case is if you take the Supreme Court to be suggesting that at some point down the road, they are going to ultimately decide that the Pence evidence is out and the tweet evidence is out. At some point, this becomes like the night fight scene in Monty Python, where like you just keep cutting limbs off a thing until it can't walk or move. And so my expectation is, while this ruling has taken a chunk out of the indictment, and Jack Smith still thinks this is a very viable indictment, the real test will come whenever there is a decision many months from now as to what can remain, and the Supreme Court looks at those decisions and says, yay or nay on the Mike Pence stuff, yay or nay on the public statement stuff, Trump's public statements. And then if they are still this unhappy with what Smith is doing, you could have a very hobbled case.
Just remarkable. Well, Devlin, thank you so much. We thought it might be a quieter spell for you since the cases were sort of in limbo, but no such luck.
No such luck.
All right. You've been busy with other stuff too. Thanks to Devlin. Thanks to J.M. Rieger. Thanks to Rhonda Colvin. I'm Libby Casey, and that does it for this week's episode of Sidebar from the Washington Post. You can find us on your favorite podcast app, and you can watch along with us by going to YouTube and looking for Washington Post. We'll join you next week where we preview the presidential debate, the first matchup really between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. Looking forward to talking with our panel about that then. See you next week.